Good morning on the West Coast of the United States. Good afternoon in the East Coast of the United States. Good evening to our audience in Europe and our audience and speakers in Israel. My name is Matan Schwartz, Director of Executive Affairs and Partnerships at the Combat Antisemitism Movement CAM. I'd like to welcome you all to this month's strategic briefing, this month of August, titled Gaza, Judea, and Samaria and the Day After, Rethinking Palestinian Governments. I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today. First speaker will be Noah Shusterman Dvir. She is the Director of Palestinians and the Region Program at Mind Israel, very well-known and common think tank in Israel. And our second speaker for the day will be Alexander T. Pack, Head of Projects and Researcher at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, ICT, at Reichman University. So I just start by addressing you two before I give you the floor. The persistent international push for Palestinian statehood overlooks the entrenched realities of terrorism and corruption within Palestinian leadership. In both Gaza and Judea and Samaria, governing bodies lack the capacity or don't deliver stability, accountability, or vision of peaceful coexistence. This briefing will examine why a serious reassessment of Palestinian governance is urgently needed. We will explore frameworks for the day after Hamas and beyond. We will look also at the Palestinian Authority's failures throughout history. Our first speaker will be Noah Shusterman Dvir. Like I mentioned, Noah Shusterman Dvir is the Director of Palestinians and the Region Program at Mind Israel. Noah's expertise focuses on Israel-Palestinian relations and broader regional dynamics. With prior roles at the INSS and the Israel Policy Forum, she has extensively researched the internal features with the Palestinian Authority and its deterring governance structures. Noah, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to debunk a few of these statements that you gave in the beginning of your, basically in your intro, and I saw this also on the email, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions when we talk about the Palestinian Authority. So let's backtrack a bit and talk about how did this war, following October 7th and the events, the massacre, how did it catch the Palestinian Authority? So the Palestinian Authority at that point was already in a crisis mode, very weak. So we talk a lot about the issue of corruption, very negative public opinion. So all of that is true. And there was a push happening from before, mostly by the Biden administration, but also the European Union, calling for a reformed Palestinian Authority. Reformed, revitalized, they used different terminology, but at the end of the day, it was quite clear to everyone that something just isn't working. That if this is supposed to be the infrastructure for a Palestinian state, it's not delivering the required outcomes that they were expecting, and that this is also being manipulated in a way or utilized by Israel to avoid entering any kind of political framework, because essentially your partner is ill-equipped to actually deliver on any kind of improvement in reality, and obviously the issue of terrorism, which I'm also going to refer to, but I'm assuming that Alex is going to talk a bit more broadly on that issue. But anyway, so from the get-go, we're looking at the Palestinian Authority in a very weak spot. And obviously the massacre and Hamas, some of the reasoning on what it was trying to do was also, it wasn't only against Israel, it was also against the Palestinian Authority. There is a lot of interdynamics within the PA, between Fatah and Hamas. And Hamas has been trying to overrun the Palestinian Authority. And this dynamic we saw very vividly in the events of May 21, what we call Guardian of the Wall operation, where it was quite clear that also the messages stemming from Hamas were also going against the Palestinian Authority and its collaborative attitude towards Israel. And this is also, we see it in the terminology used by Hamas, trying to replace the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And the way that the economic crisis that has been undergoing in the Palestinian Authority and has been actually deepening feeds into this and has been able to sort of, there's a vacuum in terms of payments for security apparatuses. I've had a conversation quite recently with somebody from the security services in Israel who said, listen, I've been entering homes of Palestinians on the job for 20 years. I look at the fridge. The situation has changed. People who used to be quite affluent, their fridges are now half empty at best. And when this comes to people who are supposed to be delivering security from the Palestinian side, then yes, this has tremendous repercussions. And so it didn't start on October 7th. It actually started in 2020, 2021. We remember there was the threat of annexation, the US moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and then essentially the Palestinian Authority and the US severing ties. So there was an escalatory dynamic between the Palestinian Authority of some of the Western partner, predominantly the US. And this was really affecting the economic situation in the PA. But then the war started. That's one element that was added here, and basically the sort of the attention that was focusing, the global attention on Gaza. But also, simultaneously, we've had a different policy implemented by Israel. And that is a policy. We have Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance and also a minister in the Ministry of Defense, who has a very coherent agenda, he's not talking about collapsing the PA, but weakening the PA. So they have been deducting funds. The PA claims it's summing up to 8 billion shekels, which is the equivalent of its annual budget. That is now the amount that they claim that Israel owes them. At the beginning, this was supposed to be done as part of the pay for slay, sort of as a retribution for pay for slay. So there was a mechanism where the PA was transferring money to families of terrorists or to families of prisoners. Now they've actually claimed to have reformed this method. My understanding from the people from the Ministry of Defense, it's quite unclear whether or not this is genuine. But anyway, Israel has a law that says that any fund that is transferred for this pay for slay mechanism, Israel is going to deduct from the clearance revenues that it is supposed to transfer to the PA as part of the Paris Protocol, the Oslo Accords. That is a big chunk of money. That is actually the most dominant part of the budget by the PA. So this was one element that was being deducted quite regularly by this new Minister of Finance. So this wasn't the case with the previous Ministers of Finance or Ministers of Defense, who are trying to utilize this law in a very careful manner because they understood the intricacies between terrorism and the economic situation. And then we've seen a few more sort of complementary elements used by the Minister of Finance to deduct more money. So now the situation is that the World Bank is alarming from basic total economic collapse of the PA. But to our surprise, it's not that it's not collapsing economically. It's a very fraught situation. But if many people within the Israeli system, but also worldwide, were fearing that, the dynamic was so sensitive in the PA that, once you're going to blow a bit too hard, then everything is going to crumble, that was actually not the case. And I think many people were caught by surprise at how firm it has been holding on to its control. Yes, there are pockets where it lacks control, mostly in the refugee camps, where Israel is now entered and is now present, and actually those refugee camps are now vacant. But it's been able to retain its control on the majority of the population within its territory. And it's been getting a lot of help, mostly from the Europeans, to an extent also from Arab countries. And I think that one of the issues of the lack of not sovereignty, but its ability to control the territory is not so much a question of motivation, but it's a problem of capability. Capability that stems first from this really problematic economic situation that is also being utilized by, we know for a fact, by Iranian actors, by spoilers who are trying to force money into the region in order to buy weapons. They're trying to direct some of these terrorist organizations. And we're experiencing more difficulty from the Palestinian apparatuses to try to hold this back, because they themselves have been receiving on average 70% of their salary for the past 3 years. Now think about this. These are the people with the weapons, with supposedly the most capable people to be doing anti-terrorism. But they have their own families and their own loans and their own, economic situations and commitments. But for 3 years, they have been receiving between 20%, 50%, 70% of their salaries systematically. And this is fund that is supposed to be frozen by the PA. It's supposed to be retributed in the future when Israel decides to give back those clearance funds. So it's a very problematic situation, and it is being manipulated by these malign actors. And the security establishment is well aware, and that is also why it's been the most vocal advocate, or maybe not vocal because they do it behind the scenes, but they've been in the discussion tables. They have been the most vocal advocates for reintroducing Palestinian workers in Israeli labor market, to deduce as much as possible from these clearance funds. Because at the end of the day, we know that when they are funded in the right manner, there is motivation. The PA does have the intention of retaining control and to showing its capability of control in its territory, because it's aspiring to regain control over Gaza. It knows that it can't do it right now. It knows that it has to go a long way for reforms, and that it has to prove or show its capabilities vis-a-vis the international community. But it's trying to do that. So if in the past, if like 2 years ago, before the war, we've had this sort of threat that was being every now and then, we heard it from our Palestinian colleagues, sort of repeating that we can always return the keys to Israel. Israel can control the West Bank and the 3 million plus people who live there. We don't hear that anymore, because the PA, the leadership of the PA, is well intent on showing that it can control as much as possible, even though it's experiencing all of these difficulties. And it has the support, a growing support within the Arab world, which if a few years ago we saw sort of a distancing between the Arab leadership and the Palestinian Authority, now the trend is the opposite. We saw the declaration last week with Saudi Arabia and France. More and more international actors are trying to, um, place the Palestinian Authority as the governing body in Gaza for the day after, with um, significant financial assistance, with significant military assistance from foreign militaries, but still, it is going to be the most dominant player. And Israel, in that way, is, when looking at the situation, is kind of seen as the negative actor because it's not accepting that vision. We can understand the reasons why. There's a lot of tension between Israel and the PA, a lot of lack of trust. But still, if we're talking about the international community and where they're trying to push, yes, they're still very well, advocating for this RPA model, and they're working at it. They're putting a lot of money in it. There are people, a lot of foreign assistance that's going into the PA, and there are changes on the ground in terms of actual building of capacity. But there's a lot more to do, and the question is Israel going to play a positive or a negative role in this dynamic?
Think, you mentioned the international community, and I'd really like to address that. Seen that the intention of France and the UK and Canada and Australia to recognize a Palestinian state with the Palestinian Authority as the governing body. And like you mentioned when you started, the Palestinian Authority are in a very low state, maybe even an all-time low. It's not a secret that they've had decades of corruption, and they're not exactly a model of a governing body. What are the expectations of these countries, states, of the Palestinian, the recognition of a Palestinian state that they want to see govern it? And will the Palestinian Authority meet these expectations, which in my own opinion, I very much doubt.
So look, the question of recognition, I think, is kind of it goes in parallel. These countries are actually putting a lot of money on what I just talked about, the issue of reform. I have to just say that each one of them also has sort of a different vision on what this reform plan is. Although there is a plan that has been approved by the EU, and the EU is the biggest funder for these reforms. And they were able also to pull in the World Bank and other international large organizations. So things are happening, but this is happening in parallel. The issue of recognition, it's a statement towards Israel. It's a statement towards the Palestinians, saying we haven't forgotten about Palestinian statehood, to Israel, saying we haven't forgotten about Palestinian statehood, but also to their own audiences. And a lot of this is rhetorics that's, it's structured for their own domestic publics. Because they do face a lot of pressure, especially in France. There's a big Muslim community. So there is a lot of domestic pressure for a more proactive attitude vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So look, at the end of the day, is the Palestinian Authority going to be a fully functioning, effective state? Is it going to be a democratic state? I don't know, probably not. None of the Arab countries around us are democratic. So I think there should also be sort of doing some expectations with the Western actors on what does it mean to be a fully functioning state? Does it necessarily have to go hand in hand with democracy? It could, but that would be up to the Palestinians if this is a democratic state or not. That doesn't have to coincide with the question, is this going to be a moderate state? And that's what we should be aiming for, because we also know how to work with non-democracies, such as the UAE. That's not a democracy, but we still like them and want to do business with them. So also when looking at this issue of what is exactly this framework of reforms in the PA, different actors have different ideas. But what we as Israel should be focusing on is moderacy, and fighting terrorism together, which is happening as we speak. Yes, it could happen more. There are many challenges within the PA. I talked about the economic aspect. It has many, many implications on equipment, on ability to train. I'm not going to go too much into depth, but it's not purely a question of motivation. I think the motivation is there. And if we would be allowing more, we, Israel, but also international community, I think they would also be doing more. But at this point, there's kind of a clash of interest between Israel and the Palestinians on that issue.
So I do want to talk a little bit about the economic issue. You mentioned you've seen refrigerators of Palestinians who are
Namia,
considered more
yeah,
even
somebody I
even
work with.
someone okay. That you mentioned people who used to be or considered affluent and now their refrigerators are much less full. Aren't the Palestinian Authority held accountable for this? I mean, they've been the governing, so-called the governing body for decades. They're the ones who people look upon to. I mean, I would think they would be the ones accountable for this situation or for this low state or all-time low state that they are at right now.
I'll tell you the problem with what you just stated. We talked about the clearance revenues. The clearance revenues is about 60% of the tax base in the Palestinian Authority. That means, and in Israel, I'll go a bit into depth on this just because it's quite um, critical to understand. Israel and the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, when they signed the Oslo Accords and then the Paris Protocol, which is the appendix, the economic appendix, they decided to have a shared customs union, which means that everything that goes into Israel is then collected, taxed, and then monthly, Israel transfers these funds to the Palestinians. So these are not Israeli taxes. These are Palestinian taxes that Israel is signed as sort of a loyalty role that is supposed to collect and transfer, and there's a percentage of management fees that is also calculated in the protocol. What has been happening since this pay for slay law that has been implemented by Israel is that Israel unilaterally deducts some of these payments. And again, this is the Palestinian Authority. It doesn't have its own, it doesn't have any other external borders. Even with the Jordanians, Israel, as part of these accords, Israel controls the border between the Palestinians and the Jordanians. So even everything that comes from the east, from the Arab countries, Israel collects those customs and taxes and then transfers them, supposedly transfers them to the Palestinians. So basically, you've cut off a hand when it comes to tax collection for the Palestinians. Yes, that's one element, and it's a crucial element. The Palestinians themselves, they're trying to do as much as they can in order to get better efficiency of, direct tax collection. It's very difficult because it's an economy that mostly relies on cash. So you have to combat a lot of this black market. Also, Israelis like to go and purchase black market things in the Palestinian Authority because it's a lot cheaper. So there's a lot of crossover between money, and they don't control there is no monetary regime that they can control. If Israel is now in an economic crisis, it can always decide to inflate to create more money because it controls the shekel. It has repercussions. It would, think of whether or not it wants to do it, but it has that tool. The Palestinians, again, going back to this Paris Protocol, they don't have that tool because they trusted Israel to be in control for this mechanism. So obviously, yes, the PA can always do better. But we also have to be very frank and ask ourselves, are we giving them, because they are living off the shekel, just FYI, did you know that even though they live off the shekel, there is not a unit in the Bank of Israel that looks on the annexes to the Israeli shekel? It looks in Israel proper, it looks at the settlements. It doesn't calculate the implications of inflation on the Palestinian market.
Couldn't
We
the
have
Palestinian Authority take care of this by now? They've been governing
no,
for so
because
long.
it's not their coin, it's not the currency. They don't control the currency. So what they do is they get loans from their own banks, and their banks are actually the Palestinian Monetary Fund is actually quite responsible. It's one of the most responsible units within the Palestinian Authority. It shut it off, the loan mechanism, because they were going too much into debt and they didn't want the Palestinian economy to collapse. So at some point, that was about 2 years ago, they started limiting the amount of loans that the Palestinian Authority can take from the Palestinian banks. So the Palestinians have been pushing for an economic reform and restructuring of the Paris Protocol for years, really. And this is one of, I think, one of the major things that can happen. And it's not a big ask actually by Israel, because at the end of the day, this is a bureaucracy. It doesn't change anything on actual status or sovereignty or question of rights. But if Israel decides to deduct less money for the management fee on the clearest revenues, that would save the Palestinian economy a lot. And we're not living 30 years ago. So there have been changes in terms of efficiency and technology. So maybe we don't need exactly the same management fees that we asked for 30 years ago. So what I'm trying to say is there are things that Israel can do, and Israel controls the money. And that's a big issue that the Palestinians, they're trying to wiggle their way around it. They're trying to get more foreign funds through, mostly through, what's it called? And not investments, assistance, foreign assistance, which that was actually the majority of their budget up until recently, and then this past couple of years, again, some of these Arab countries that have stopped giving them the assistance have returned to do that, although in a rather low capacity. So they're trying to build capability, economic capability, but it's very, very difficult if you're already in such a low point and you're already in debt to the most prominent sector in the Palestinian community, which is the public sector. So yeah.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for your insights. I still have a lot to ask you. We'll come back at the end, at the conclusion. But for now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Alexander T. Pack. Alexander is a researcher and head of projects at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, ICT, and also a faculty member in university. Alex specializes in analyzing terrorist structures and extremist use of emerging technologies. His work provides critical insight into the operational resilience of groups like Hamas and the strategic imperatives for post-conflict governance in Gaza. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Matan. Thank you. And Noah, thank you as well. I have to say, Matan, that I was just constantly nodding my head along as Noah was discussing the idea of capacity, because that's part of what I wanted to talk about today as we're looking to what a day after looks like. I have a couple of slides because I'm going to get a little bit theoretical with everyone for just a moment because I'm a researcher at my core. So I really want to talk about what is the day after actually, because as we're looking at this long-term strategy of who is going to govern in Gaza, who is going to govern in the West Bank, who is going to govern these Palestinian territory, we have to think about what that day after looks like. And before we can do that, we really need to think about what do we mean by counterterrorism for just a moment. Counterterrorism is primarily interested in operational successes, right? The goal of counterterrorism is to disrupt or destroy terrorist infrastructure, terrorist operatives, and terror attacks. But operational success doesn't always equal strategic success. A good way to think about counterterrorism is through the counterterrorism equation, which was developed by a colleague and a mentor of mine, Professor Boaz Ganor, over about 20 years of research. And what he boiled it down to was terrorism happens when there is both capability for terrorism, so the operational tools of terrorism, and the motivation to carry out terrorism. So enough hate to actually do it. Our goal is ultimately to lower both capability and motivation to prevent terrorism, but the reality is often very different because we see this counterterrorism equation sitting on a fulcrum, wherein you lower one. So in this instance, we're seeing kinetic operations in Gaza, lowering the operational capability of an organization like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But at the exact same time, those operations are raising the motivation. They're raising the disdain, the anger at Israel. They're raising this anger at the counter-terrorists and the motivation to carry out further attacks. Our ultimate goal, though, should be to focus also on decreasing the motivation. And this can be done through social operations. This can be done through political operations. This can be done through social support systems. So when Noah was discussing the idea of capacity building and generating a governing partner, that's exactly what we're talking about here. So when we're looking at the day after, we generally in the reading that I've done, in the research that I do at the ICT and outside of the ICT, we see four main options, right? One is that Israel unilaterally withdraws from Gaza. This has the benefit that it's relatively quick. It's a cease of operations, a cease of loss of life. But there are drawbacks to this. Hamas could return to power almost immediately. We've seen Hamas growing in strength again as this war has continued to wage on. The hostages are still left in Gaza if Israel unilaterally withdraws. And there's no change ultimately in the status quo within Gaza, and we're simply returning to what has been shown to be a failing strategy. The second option is Israel chooses to perpetually occupy Gaza. This has, again, benefits and drawbacks for each. One is that Israel can claim to maintain some sense of security control over Gaza and this border that exists, and it reduces, theoretically, a risk of additional attacks by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But there's also significant drawbacks to this option. Like we're seeing immense loss of life in this conflict right now. We're seeing a lack of Palestinian autonomy under this option. And also, ultimately, there will be an international backlash. Israel would become potentially a pariah state for doing that. The third option is that the PA immediately takes over Gaza. But as Noah pointed out when she was speaking, the PA just doesn't have the capability to do this right now. There's also a genuine lack of trust in the PA in certain sectors of the Palestinian society, and especially in Israeli society, which leads to some of this lack of capacity. This option is good because it does allow for a peaceful withdrawal from Gaza while giving Palestinian autonomy and governance control so that there can be a governing partner there. And it replaces, theoretically, Hamas without leaving a power vacuum. The problems, though, are there's no clear governance capacity for the PA at the moment. And there's ultimately the potential resurgence of Hamas, which we saw in the early 2000s when Hamas was able to usurp the power of the PA in Gaza. The fourth option that we hear a lot of is that an external party, whether this be with or without coordination with the PA, decides to take over. Here we can see Israel withdrawal, we can see the replacement of Hamas as a governing body, but the big problem here is that there is a lack of international consensus. No one actually wants to put boots on the ground that would be acceptable to all of the parties involved on this side of the world. There's also a clear lack of Palestinian autonomy if the PA isn't involved, if there isn't some form of governance authority that is Palestinian-led and owned. So what I advocate based on my research is that we should be looking at this conflict as through an insurgency lens. We need to be thinking about Gaza and the West Bank and the terrorist organizations that are there as insurgents rather than exclusively terrorism. Because terrorism is about attacks, terrorism is about destruction, terrorism is about fear. But in addition to that, we see these terror groups attempting to assert governing authority. We see them engaging in social services, building schools, building hospital clinics, building social services for their communities, bringing food to people. And by combining these two elements together, they're able to ingrain themselves in the population. They're able to generate a significant amount of support, whether that's through fear or through generated loyalty. And our goal here should be to find a strategy that isn't one day after, because it's not possible in a single day. This is 1,000 days after. This is 2,000 days after. This is a long-term change that we need to work towards. And our ultimate goal should be to separate the fish from the water. Because again, counterterrorism is exclusively about disrupting the terrorist actors or destroying the terrorist infrastructure. Counterinsurgency, which is the lens that I'm suggesting and the lens that the research suggests when we look at other counterinsurgency operations around the world, is that you can compete for control with the insurgent, with the terror organization that's governing, and you can try and gain popular support. But at the same time that you're doing this, Israel can't do it alone. Israel doesn't have the they're not legitimate in the eyes of the Palestinian people at the moment. It's not recognized as a body that can do this. So what we're looking at is a 3 stages of development of a coin strategy. So this is kinetic operations, security operations, and development operations. And there are 3 stages to this that need to take place. A clear, hold, and build strategy that ultimately, over the course of years, will allow for a sustained replacement for Hamas that has the capacity to truly govern and be a partner in this region. So in clearing operations, we're primarily utilizing kinetic operations at this stage. We're looking at clearing sectors from Hamas, removing them from the area, and then moving from territory to territory, removing those operational tools that they possess, and then engaging in security operations in those to allow civilians to safely return to those areas. Then we get to the hold operations, where we continue clearing operations, moving north. The IDF can do it, an external partner can do it. But as they're doing that, they need to also expand these security operations and begin administering law and administering services, while also bringing in significant international aid to start to rebuild and to allow the population to move away from the extremist movements and move towards what we all want, right? To live our lives, to go home to our families, to see our children grow up, right? Finally, we get to the build stage. And at this stage, we're primarily engaging in security and development activities. So at this stage, we begin building support for local governmental structures and transitioning these services and the security operations to these local indigenous structures. And then we continue building these efforts throughout. But the reality of the situation is this is not a day after strategy. This is 1,000 days after, 2,000 days after. This is going to take years to build, and it's going to need international support. Like I said, Israel doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of members of the Palestinian population right now. And they need some sense of support, and they need to work with a body that already has that support. So here we can see the PA taking an outsized role, but they need the capacity to be able to engage in these development and these security operations as Israel continues to try and reduce the operational capabilities of other partners or other parties like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is not an easy fix by any means, but I don't see in my research another potential strategy that yields the kind of structured and sustained peaceful result that we're looking for. Otherwise, we're just returning to the idea of what the Israeli military refers to as mowing the grass, where you engage in short-term operations, reduce the capability, and then go back to the status quo until the next time that operational capability of the terrorist organization has grown up again, and we have to go back, and they have to go back in and reduce it. This is going to require sustained effort. It's not going to be comfortable, but it's the only way forward. And it requires Israel to start looking at international partnerships with potentially external coalition forces, who those parties are, whether that's Egypt or Jordan or the Emirates. There needs to be some sense of an external coalition force to support these security operations, and there needs to be an influx of support for the Palestinian Authority so that they're able to potentially serve as this governing partner here.
Right, thank you. So I would like to ask you, that being said, billions of dollars have gone into the Gaza Strip over the years, if it's from Qatar or other organizations or even countries. So far, that money over the years has built basically a culture of terrorism. I mean, why would one assume that the current influx of international billions that are coming in would create an infrastructure of good governance or peace or prosperity?
So you raise an excellent point. Like in Gaza, we see Hamas taking all of this substantial aid, all of this substantial support from over the years, and they have built a terrorist power plant essentially in Gaza, right? Where they're able to take these billions of dollars and divert them to weaponry or divert them to training or divert them to radicalization. But this is the nature of insurgency. They're only able to do that because they are the recognized governing body. There isn't a viable alternative in Gaza right now. And that's what the idea of a coin strategy is supposed to do. It's supposed to unseat this governing body that represents the judiciary, the executive, the security forces, unseat them and provide a viable alternative that then can use that money for better services, better support. I mean, as my cohort Noah was saying, the PA wants to do this. We see that there is evidence that the PA wants to reduce terrorism. We see that they're cooperating with the Israeli security services when they can, but they lack the capacity to truly defeat an insurgent because an insurgent only has to be right once. The counterinsurgent has to be right all the time. They don't get to make a mistake. The insurgent just has to find one chink in the armor and they can carry out an attack that serves as a spoiler, that derails the process. And that's what we saw in the early 2000s when Hamas was able to take control, is the PA lacked full-fledged support. The PA lacked the capability to tamp down Hamas, and Hamas was able to tap into deep-seated anger at the time and come out on top. And then when there was pushback from the PA and the Palestinian security forces, we saw Hamas begin to engage in violence.
Ask you, and I would also actually like Noah to answer this question because you really fed into this question. There is this notion in the community or in the world that people are pushing the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza in the day after. Also, you have many Israeli officials who have said so, who believe this. But why do we have this opinion, we have this idea to push the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza when they're not even capable of governing where they're governing right now, if you can even call it governing? So I'd like to start with you, Alex, and Noah, I'd like to hear your opinion as well.
I think to some degrees it's a bit disingenuous to say that they're not capable of governing entirely, because I think that they've been dealt a hard hand. They don't have the full capacity to be able to govern as fully necessary, right? Because, like as Noah discussed, they don't have full control over the currency, which is a unique problem to a governing body. But additionally, they have significant insurgent activity even within the West Bank. We see terrorist organizations in the West Bank that are trying to unseat the Palestinian Authority and try to remove their legitimate governing power within there in that domain. if they're given the tools and the resources to be able to maintain that control of the West Bank, I don't know why they wouldn't be able to extend that to Gaza if they were given the resources and the support. We're looking for a governing partner here, right? I don't think that Israel is looking to govern the entirety of the West Bank or Gaza, and I don't know that Israel should want to. We need Israel needs to recognize that maybe it needs a partner to support this effort, and the PA is standing there with open hands.
So first, I agree with Alex, and I would like to add that, look, there aren't many options. Somebody needs to do it, preferably a Palestinian and not an Israeli. And it's also kind of to continue Alex's point, Israel doesn't collect the trash in the PA. It doesn't provide health services, social services, education. We don't need to do that because this is no longer a military rule. We actually did that in the past, and there was a reason that Israel had an interest in stopping that policy, because you don't want military to be controlling and governing civilian lives. It's a very difficult task. Ask some of these former governors of Jenin and of Gaza. These were military men who, they fought in the trenches, and then they were giving the keys to start governing thousands of people and administering health services. It's not an easy task to do it as an occupying power. And obviously, you're always going to be facing resistance because you are an occupying power in the sense that the local population is not accepting your presence in that territory. The PA is not facing the same situation. Yes, people have, they're full of criticism towards the PA, but are they now willing to collapse it and then have that military governance again by Israel? I think for argument's sake, they're going to maybe say yes sometimes because they kind of like to annoy Israelis when they ask about this. But at the end of the day, no, they enjoy the fact that, they have signs in Arabic. There's a sense of pride. They're very nationalist. So it's not that this experiment of 30 years called the Palestinian Authority. Yes, it has many problems, but it's not a totally failed experience. It has benefits to the Palestinian people, and the fact that we can still work with the Palestinian security apparatuses. There were times where in 2010, for example, yes, this cooperation was much tighter than it is now. But even now, with all the problems that we have, it's persisting. And Israel is interested in that because it reduces the assignments that the Israeli security forces need to do. So there's a mutual benefit to both parties. So I wouldn't, put this under the title of a collapse, of a failed experiment. Yes, there's a lot more that needs to be done. We should all ask ourselves, is everyone being a positive player? And what are the alternatives? Somebody needs to govern. Somebody needs to, this is a hard task. Somebody needs to do it. I don't see too many people offering themselves to do it. Also not Israel. Even within the settlement movement, they're talking about having this small emirates of self-governance. They don't want to be the ones collecting the trash in Jenin. They want the Palestinians to do it. And the Palestinians say, listen, you want us to do it? Then we need substance. We need this to be connected to some story of a nationalist story. And that's where things clash between Israel and the Palestinians.
All right. So just before we finish, and we have to be brief because we are nearing the end of our time, I'd like to address a question from the audience. you can both just be very short and brief. And this question is the Palestinian Authority for long-term coexistence with Israel? Alex, you go first.
I think that if we're looking, at the history of the Palestinian Authority for the last 30-ish years, I think that the Palestinian Authority is interested in coexistence because they understand that there isn't an alternative. The state of Israel exists. The Palestinian Authority would like a state of Palestine, and I don't know that there's an alternative. I think that they're pragmatists in the Palestinian Authority, and they recognize that and are willing to work towards that. Unlike, for instance, Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who make it very clear that they're not interested in coexistence whatsoever. They don't recognize the state of Israel as a state. They don't recognize Western states in certain instances as states. So the Palestinian Authority is the governing partner for the moment, and I think that they recognize that.
No, please. You're on mute.
Yeah, so just quick remark. I think the Israeli collective memory is very short term in the sense that for Palestinians, 1988 was a very monumental year because that was the year that Yasser Arafat accepted the existence of Israel next to Palestine. Essentially, that was the acceptance of Palestine, that when Palestinians accepted the 67 borders. Ever since this is, and we see this kind of returning every now and then in the discussions with amongst the interdynamic of Palestinians, is the question of 88. Should we now backtrack on the recognition of Israel? This has not happened yet, even though Mahmoud Abbas at the UN on stage in the General Assembly, I think this was 3-4 years ago, said, next year, if there isn't any substantial developments regarding a political framework, then we are going to return on our affirmation of the 88 Declaration. That hasn't happened. So we are still in the same situation where the Palestinian Authority and the PLO are accepting of Israel in the same terms that were framed in 88. And I think we should also ask ourselves then who is our partner? Who are we working with? Who are we emboldening? And one of the things that me as a researcher have been talking about for the past few years is that we knew that we were working mostly or being responsive to Hamas and not to the PA. And that's on us. And the question is, are we now cognizant of that problem and willing to face the fact that the PA is still the most relevant partner with all its flaws, but we should be building the partner that we want, but not instead of, hitting it on the head and then wishing for it to change and become something that it's not.
Time, and we finish the strategic briefing for this month. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Dvir from Mind Israel. I want to thank Alexander Pack from ICT. Thank the audience here today. We have a strategic briefing about once a month. We're subscribed to our newsletter. The invitation and the registration. So please join us every month for the briefing. And thank you very much.